I was walking. It was an eternity. I was walking down a corridor that was so long. It seemed so long to me that day.
Мені кажеться, якби не вона, я, мабуть, би.
I think if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't have survived. I'm honestly telling you, she was like a ray of light in a dark kingdom.
These are the rooms of that dark kingdom. The detention centers of Kherson, southwest Ukraine. When Ukrainian troops liberated the city, the scenes were euphoric. But liberation also revealed the horror of prolonged Russian occupation. In Kherson, over 254 days, they built a network of 26 detention centers to control the local population. At least hundreds, but possibly thousands, were taken.
Током вони мене били, струмом до тих.
They electrocuted me until I lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, they started all over again.
Among them were Olga and Svetlana, who had spent 280 days in captivity. 9 months of detention, but years' worth of physical punishment on their bodies. They would keep each other alive. Sky News has spoken to 15 Ukrainians who are detained in Kherson, working to corroborate their accounts using official documents and open source imagery, as part of a year-long investigation into potential war crimes. What they describe, speaking for the first time, is a systematic campaign of torture.
As soon as you have war crimes being committed within a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, you are well within the territory of crimes against humanity, and that's what happened in Kherson.
An August day in Kyiv.
Нам, будь ласка, еспресо з молоком 2.
Anyone passing by might see two old friends getting coffee and chatting away.
Будемо пити за...
But Olga and Svetlana's friendship is relatively new and forged by horrifying circumstances. This is where they first met, the detention center on Teplin-Kiev Street in Kherson. Olga Cherniak was a civil servant before the war. Kherson had been under Russian occupation for 3 months when she was detained and taken to the prison site, already notorious. Her first morning there, she was removed from her cell, blindfolded, and led down a corridor. Her son was inside the room next door. She recognized him by his screams.
В кімнаті були відкриті, ось так двері, а мене поставили тут біля стіни.
The door was like this, and I was put there, against the wall, and I stood and listened to how they tortured my child.
Його били струмом.
He was being beaten with electricity, he was crying a lot, and he asked them to stop.
Olga's son begged her to tell the Russians what they wanted. Then it was her turn. They took her to the same room with peach-coloured walls and to the same chair.
А вони мені на ці вказівні пальці наділи.
And they put these metal tongs on my index fingers. Honestly, at my age, I didn't even understand what they were.
Від них ідуть такі два проводки.
There are 2 wires coming from them, and a small metal box like this,
Така металева з перемикачем таким.
with a switch, a button, and a small lever.
І ще якийсь там такий маленький такий був рычажок.
Because when the older one said to increase the current, another one turned that lever, the current was increased.
Током вони мене били струмом до тих пір, поки...
They electrocuted me until I lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, they started all over again.
None of this had been imaginable before the war. But by March 2022, Russian forces which had broken out of Crimea were advancing towards Kherson. Kherson became the first big city in Ukraine to fall to the Russians. But many resisted, including Svetlana Shukhailo. She was also a civil servant, working in soil protection. Svetlana filmed videos of troop movements like these, crouched behind the window in her flat, and sent them to the Ukrainian authorities.
So he was my small part. I stayed at home and could not leave. My age allowed me to be here. There won't be any suspicion. That was my small cover.
The Russians struggled to control the local population and knew there were informants throughout the city. So they started rounding people up. Neighbours turned on neighbours, friends turned on friends. Svetlana was betrayed by one of the people she'd been feeding information to. Armed soldiers wearing balaclavas took her to the same detention centre. That was where Olga and Svetlana met, beginning a friendship that would save their lives.
Svetlana was already sitting there, and I came in with such frightened eyes, and I didn't know what to do. She takes me by the hand and tells me everything will be fine. You just have to believe in the good.
She was panicking a bit.
She says, don't panic.
Yes, keep praying, girls. All will be well.
She took my hand, and from the moment she held my hand, that's how, hand in hand, we made it out of captivity.
Their story started in Kherson, southern Ukraine. Both were held here, on Teplin ahead to Kiev Street. The Russians ran 5 other sites in the city centre, and 26 throughout the wider Kherson region, identified by the Media Initiative for Human Rights, a Ukrainian NGO Sky News has worked with as part of our investigation. Olga and Svetlana would be taken to these 4 as they were transported further away from home. The detention centre on Teplin ahead to Kiev Street was busy. Anton Lemarkin was also held there. He was a policeman who had been passing information to the Ukrainian military. The Russians had been looking for him for months when he was betrayed by his friend.
They just brought me to the edge of a trench or a pit. I saw a cliff and they brought me to my knees in front of the cliff. They told me to pray and put a gun to my forehead. They fired 3 short bursts near my left ear.
They took him for interrogation, beat him with a baton and applied electric shocks. When Anton refused to answer, they tried a new tactic.
I had a black t-shirt and they've taken the end of it and covered my head completely so that I wouldn't see anything and so that the clothes would cover my face. They brought in water in 5-6 liter bottles and started pouring water. They poured water until you start to lose consciousness or start vomiting. And they're holding you. Then you start shaking. And then they let you go. And then you only had a few seconds to spit out the water and take a few breaths. Then they immediately put you back down and poured water again.
But while Anton, Olga and Svetlana were being held, the Ukrainian military was fighting back and advancing on Kherson. By October, 3 months into their detention, the military was on the outskirts of the city.
We were waiting for our troops to come, to open the door, to liberate us from this captivity.
But as the Russians withdrew from Kherson, they took their prisoners with them, over the Dnipro River into Russian-occupied territory to a town called Holopristan. They waited another 2 months. And then, in December, Anton was set free, without explanation. He travelled back to Oleshki, a town still occupied by Russia, but the closest city to now liberated Kherson. He hid there for months, until the dam burst. On June the 6th, the Kakhovska hydroelectric dam was blown up. 230 square miles of territory downstream was flooded, and Anton saw his chance. He and a friend swam through the floodwaters on top of an air mattress, trying to find a boat. They spent 3 days looking.
We saw the bodies of the dead, drowned, several old people. We saw many drowned animals as well.
They camped out on rooftops until eventually they found a small boat.
There were moments when the current was twisting and tossing the boat. You row, but the current is so strong that you just stand still.
But after hours of effort, they made it to the other side. Anton was home, but Olga and Svetlana had been taken further away. They had been transported across the Dnipro at the same time as Anton, and on the same route, first to Holopristan and then onwards to Cheplinka, a village further south on the way to Crimea. But then they were taken even further into occupied territory, to Novotroysk.
Every day was really terrible. It was hard when we counted 3 months. And then they passed. Then we were told that they would release us before the new year. But they didn't. You broken each time.
On May the 17th this year, 2 agents from the FSB, Russia's security service, came to visit Olga. They told her she could go.
I said, I'm with Svetlana together. I will only go with her. We are like needle and thread. And I say no, only with her.
9 long months after their initial detention, they were free.
When we were let free, we were in shock. We could not believe this was happening. This was on May 17th. It was a clear, positive day full of light, and we were still in shock. We didn't believe we were free, and no one chased us. We were 2 people who hadn't seen light for half a year. We were like 2 battery farm hands who finally saw the light of God.
But they were still deep inside occupied territory, and because of the fighting, the quickest way home was blocked. Instead, they made a long and arduous journey, over thousands of miles, through Crimea up to Moscow, over the border to Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and finally, Ukraine. Svetlana had promised Olga they would return. They'd each lost around 30 kilograms. Svetlana's eyesight was failing, Olga's hair had turned white, and she had bruises along her spine. But the promise had been kept. Olga and Svetlana were finally reunited with their families, who had never stopped looking for them. And they went back to liberated Kherson. Months later, Olga once again stepped foot inside the walls that kept her prisoner. She sent us this video, reminders of the traumas she and Svetlana endured and escaped from.
We were brought here to the detention center, my whole family. Russians drove a car into the yard, pulled us out of the car, ordered us to keep our hands behind our backs and led us along this wall. They took me out of the cell, took me by the hands, and led me down the corridor, and I didn't even realize what was happening. This is where my husband was interrogated. And this is the room where I was interrogated. I was sitting on this chair.
Basic comforts became unimaginable luxury. Prisoners were allowed to shower sometimes just once a week, and then for only 2 minutes. But Olga told us the showers felt like a holiday.
This is the cell where my son was kept. My son was held here for 15 days, where he was also forced to sing the Russian anthem, shout "Glory to Shoigu," "Glory to Putin," "Glory to Russia."
But more than 400 people who also entered the detention centres are still unaccounted for. And Ukrainian authorities are still investigating them, with the help of Wayne Jordash KC, a human rights lawyer, and his team. He is unequivocal about what the Russians did.
What is clear is that the torture was designed to essentially lock down the civilian population in Kherson. And then, apart from the war crimes, you have crimes against humanity of torture, persecution, again deportation and so on. So it's a campaign, it's a policy, and it's undoubtedly, in my view, from what I've seen, driven by and from the Kremlin.
We asked the Russian government to comment on the allegations in our investigation, but received no reply. And even those like Olga who made it out have only escaped into a different type of prison.
Коли мене чоловік привіз додому перший день,
When my husband brought me home the first day, I stood at the door, I started crying and said, "I'm so scared, I'm afraid."
коли я бачу чоловіка,
When I see a man in black clothes and a black cap, I recall these 2 men who kidnapped us, who tortured us. I immediately get scared. I make myself think they are not after me. That's just my nightmares. I'm afraid of a knock on the door.
Olga and Svetlana still lean on each other, just as they did in captivity. Every morning, they text each other.
We do it every day. We don't forget.
Svetlana sends me a good morning and I put a heart.
мені допомогла тільки Світлана.
Svetlana was my only help. She was the only reason I survived.
I don't agree. We supported each other. We supported each other because we had something to talk about, something to be together for. But these were very difficult situations. We supported each other. We just realized that without each other, it would be even worse.